And we're going to start with number 21. And if you need extra review packets, I put some extra review packets up there. So if you need extra one. So, number 21, the Treaty of Wangia. And then I've got Caleb Cushing on there. So let's go to 21. And this has to do with China. So this is a treaty put down between the U.S. and China. A treaty between the United States and China. And Caleb Cushing, the name's spelled there for you, he went with 4 warships. President Tyler, I don't think you have to remember the president, but in 1844, Caleb Cushing and 4 warships showed up, 4 U.S. warships showed up at China. And that led to this treaty between China and the United States. And the main thing to remember about this treaty is that China gave the U.S. most favored nation status. So China gave the U.S. most favored nation status. China gave the U.S. most favored nation status. Meaning that the U.S., what does most favored nation status mean? That just meant that the U.S. received all of the trading rights that any other country in the world got with China. So to get most favored nation status means you receive all of the trading terms that are given to all other countries of the world. It means that you get the best deal as far as trade. We got the best deal as far as trade with China. We got all the rights that any other nation in the world had for trading with China. So most favored nation status is, this idea is there's no other country that's going to get a better deal than you are as far as trade. Remember, hopefully you guys remember to put 20 up there when you signed in. I'll change it. If you put 15, I'm going to change it to 20 anyway, because this is worth 20. Treaty of and I do not speak Japanese or Chinese, so I apologize to any speakers of those languages for really messing it up here. But the Treaty of Kanagawa was between the United States and Japan. So this was between the U.S. and Japan, and Matthew Perry was sent again with warships to Japan. What you need to know about this is Japan was basically totally a cocoon of isolation starting in the 1600s. So starting in the 1600s, Japan basically was totally closed off from the rest of the world. It's really interesting history, by the way, of that country. Totally closed off, totally isolated. They wanted nothing to do with anything outside Japan. So maybe just put down, since the 1600s, Japan had been totally cut off from the world. They had cut themselves off. You don't have to put this down, but for example, foreign sailors who shipwrecked on the shores of Japan were not allowed to leave. If you had a shipwreck and ended up in Japan, you can never leave Japan for the rest of your life. They basically wanted nothing to do with the outside world. The key about Matthew Perry is he's the one who broke that open. He broke open, with this treaty, we broke open that isolationism. We broke open this cocoon of isolationism. This 2-century shell of isolationism that they were 200 years cut off from the world. The U.S. helped break it open with Matthew Perry, sent warships, they negotiated this treaty, and the things that we got from this treaty were 2 major things. Number 1, it allowed U.S. ships to refuel at 2 Japanese ports. So U.S. ships could refuel at 2 Japanese ports. Those are known as coaling rights. So U.S. ships could refuel at 2 Japanese ports known as coaling rights. And it provided for proper treatment of shipwrecked sailors. I believe they would now be allowed to return to the United States if they shipwrecked in Japan. So it provided for proper treatment of shipwrecked sailors. So it cracked open Japan's 2-century shell of isolation, as I told you. So big. And if you want to know, like, what does this have to do with anything we're learning? If you maybe put this down, is that after the Mexican War, we wanted to increase our trade with Southeast Asia because we now had Pacific ports to trade with Southeast Asia. So these are very important in the context of the history because now that we had California, we had Pacific ports to trade with Southeast Asia. So these, we wanted to trade with China, we wanted to trade with Japan. That was the whole idea of manifest destiny. Remember, you get ports in destiny, you get ports to trade with Southeast Asia. All right, Gadsden Purchase, number 23. This was something that the South wanted. And what the Gadsden Purchase is it was the southern part of Arizona. It's like the southern, today it's the southern slice of Arizona and part of New Mexico. And the U.S. wanted to purchase part of Mexico. So what we did in the Gadsden Purchase is we ended up buying a slice of Mexico, small slice of Mexico. Now, you would think we would have enough, right? I mean, we just took half their country from them. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico basically gave away half their country to the United States. And now we wanted more. Why did we want this land? Why did especially Southerners want this land? It's just this, it was a nice low-lying land through the desert. Dylan?
The Transcontinental Railroad.
For the Transcontinental Railroad. So we wanted this land for part of it. The South wanted it for a Transcontinental Railroad. So the South wanted that land for the Transcontinental Railroad. They wanted to connect New Orleans to the Pacific. And that's why, as we started talking about yesterday, when Stephen Douglas was like, no, we want the North to have the Transcontinental Railroad, they had to give something to the South. And that's why they allowed for popular sovereignty north of the 3630 line. All right, we are now going to go to number 41. And I love the Civil War, and 41, we're going to do 41 to 58. I love the Civil War. If I could have till like 10 o'clock, not that any of you would stay, but I could just keep on going and going and going and going and teaching and teaching and teaching. But I decided that of all the things in this unit, this was the most expendable as far as what's the most important thing to know. So I'd love to teach about it, but it was the most expendable as far as I didn't think it was important enough to do in class, but it's important enough that you have to know it. So, number one, advantages of the North. Coming into what happened is that South Carolina seceded, and then 6 other states joined them before the Confederate States of America. And then at Fort Sumter, the war started, the firing of Fort Sumter. Eventually, 4 states more secede, so there's 11 states in the Confederate States of America, 11 slave states. And then there were 4 slave states that never broke away from the Union. They're called the Loyal Border States, or 4 slave states that never broke away from the Union. So, what were the advantages of the North in this war? That lasted 4 years and killed more Americans than pretty much all the other wars combined. What were the advantages of the North? Go ahead, Nick.
Most of the nation's factories.
Most of the nation's factories, right. So the North had most of the nation's factories. What was another advantage? Go ahead, Jessica.
Transportation. Better transportation.
Yeah, they had most of the nation's railroads. 71% of the nation's railroads. Another advantage of the North. Justin.
More people.
They had 2.5 times the population. More people. 2.5 times the population. And Natalie. They had a superior navy. Exactly. They had a superior navy. You know, that navy could pretty much block every harbor. They basically bottle up every harbor and starve the South to death. And in the long run, that's what they did. Advantages of the South. The biggest advantage they had, so moving on then, the biggest advantage that the South had was they were fighting a defensive war. What does that mean? That the South was fighting a defensive war. The biggest advantage that they had, Brooke, go ahead.
They were just defending what they had. They weren't.
Right, they didn't have to take over. What it means is the South only had to defend its territory. The South did not have to take over any territory to win. The North, on the other hand, pretty much had to take over the entire South, or reconquer the entire South in order to win. All the South had to do is defend their territory. And that's a huge advantage, because it's easier than having to take over land. It's easier to defend. You know the territory better. You have a friendly civilian population. You can basically dig in and wait for them to come to you, even though that's not really what Robert E. Lee is going to do. You have that advantage. So defensive war. What were the other advantages of the South? Other big advantages of the South? Justin?
Better generals.
Better generals, right. They had better generals. Lincoln has problems finding a general that he likes. He doesn't really, basically incompetent general after incompetent after incompetent until he finally gets Grant. He's not afraid to win. And then another advantage that the South had, so the South tended to have better generals. Another advantage that the South had. Yep, go ahead, Hannah.
Had higher morale. They thought they were fighting for their homeland.
It's kind of part of the defensive war. It's the part of the whole concept of fighting defensive war. It's higher morale. Better, yeah, go ahead.
Didn't consider had the cotton industry? They kind of had wars and
They thought that Great Britain and France would take their side. They thought that because Great Britain and France needed cotton, so another advantage is Great Britain and France needed southern cotton. Great Britain and France's economy needed southern cotton. So Great Britain and France needed southern cotton. And they thought that Great Britain and France would take their side for sure. And then finally they had better trained soldiers. Better trained soldiers. They were bred to fight. Southern boys were brought up with guns. They knew how to shoot a gun better than the northern boy. Southern boys were brought up with guns. They really had what we would call a culture of violence in the South. They had the dueling tradition. So they were bred to fight from an early age compared to northerners. So those are advantages of the South. All right, moving on to conscription during the Civil War. Does anyone know what conscription means? What does the word conscription mean, anyone? So number 43, conscription during the Civil War. What does conscription mean? Go ahead, Nick.
Was it voluntary to be in the war?
Nope, it's a draft. It's when you're forced to fight. So conscription is another word for the draft. And the draft was instituted in both the North and South. That basically means you have no choice. They randomly pick numbers or whatever. Your number comes up. You have to fight. You have no choice. However, I'd like you to put down that the vast majority of fighters in the Civil War were volunteers. The vast majority of fighters were volunteers. And there's two reasons why. And you should know why. Because it was a disgrace to be drafted. It was like social stigma, like what's wrong with, there's really a bad stigma to being drafted. It was a disgrace because it's almost like, well, what are you, too wimpy to fight or to want to fight, and what's wrong with you? Why didn't you sign up and volunteer? So people wanted to volunteer because there's a lot of social pressure to volunteer. The other one is that you could collect a bounty, a cash payment for volunteering. So you could get, it's like what we would call in the NFL a signing bonus. Yeah, they had a bounty, which is a signing. You sign in the military, you get a cash payment for signing up. It's called a bounty. And then in your book it talks about the bounty jumpers, that basically signed up and then deserted and went 50 miles down the road and signed up for that regiment and then disappeared and then signed up for the next one. One guy did this 38 times, as your book describes. 38 times he signed up. And then, before he was caught, 38 times he signed up for 38 different regiments and collected 38 different bounties. Substitution, number 44. What's substitution? Go ahead, Jamie.
Is it when you found someone to go in your place?
Right, it's where you pay someone to serve in your place. If you're drafted, you pay another soldier to serve in your place. So Ian gets drafted, he pays Tommy to serve in his place. That's substitution. People did this in both the North and the South. Number 45 then, what's commutation? What exactly is commutation? Commutation is where you pay a certain amount of money to the government to avoid being drafted. You pay a certain amount of money to the government to avoid being drafted, and in the North it was $300. You paid a certain amount of money to the government in order to avoid being drafted. In the North it was $300. That's a lot of money. That's like a whole year's wages. You're poor, unless you have draft insurance, and they actually did have draft insurance where you could pay insurance, and if you're drafted, they would give you the $300, draft insurance. Unless you had that, that was like a whole year's wages. You had to be pretty rich to buy your way out of the war. All right, going on to the 20 Negro Law, number 46. What was the 20 Negro Law? Go ahead, Julia.
You gotta have like 20 slaves to get out of the war.
Yeah, if you were an owner or overseer of 20 or more slaves, you did not have to fight. You could be exempted from the draft. So it basically exempted an owner or overseer of 20 or more slaves from service. An owner or overseer of 20 or more slaves from service. So the planters, not a lot of planters actually, a lot of planters, like someone who owns 20 or more slaves, a lot of them did fight in the Confederacy, but a planter could basically go to get out of having to fight, and then you had all these poor white Southern boys getting shot at by Yankees and getting killed that didn't even own slaves. And it led to a very famous line about the South during the war. And does anyone remember what that line was? People basically said, this is a something war, but a something something fight. Do you remember that from reading it? Go ahead. Jack, go ahead.
This is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight.
Yep, and put that down in your notes. It led to the saying, this is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Which, by the way, you can almost say about every war in our history. But this line became famous. They called it a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. All these poor people without slaves fighting to defend the institution of slavery. Number 47. And again, if I go too fast, let me know because lots of info. Martial law. What martial law is, it is when the military can arrest and detain without trial. The military can arrest and detain without trial civilians suspected of aiding the enemy. So martial law is when the military can arrest and detain without trial civilians suspected of aiding the enemy. Arrest and detain without trial civilians suspected of aiding the enemy. You want to know what that is? Basically military rule. The military rules and can arrest people. And you've got military people in the streets if necessary. Acting like police. Like Hitler, Nazi Germany had this. And then to suspend the writ of habeas corpus is that people no longer, to suspend the writ means that people no longer have the right to go to court to show they have been unlawfully in prison. It's basically means that you don't have the right to see a judge when arrested. Probably the best way to think of it is the writ of habeas corpus is the right to see a judge when you're arrested, so you're not just thrown in prison and forgotten about. But to suspend the writ of habeas corpus means that when you're arrested,